Space is one of the most overused terms in Overwatch. Everyone has some nebulous idea of what it is, but we want to make sure we understand it in a way that's actually useful. Next week I'm doing a video on a resource-based view of fights in Overwatch, and this one's kind of an introduction to that, because understanding space or map control as one of those resources that teams trade throughout a fight is how we can take this kind of abstract concept and break it down into something digestible. The first thing to understand about space is that there's typically 4 different types. We have friendly space, enemy space, contested space, and free or uncontested space. Friendly space is pretty simple. It's just an area of the map that our team is currently controlling. This could mean we are literally standing in it, like with a Rhine or more a Lucio comp, but it could also mean that we're able to comfortably do whatever we want within that area. Like if our team has great flank or angle control, individually we can move wherever we want within that space, so we can pretty much say the whole thing is under our control. Enemy space is obviously the same, but for the enemy, and this green uncontested space is space that isn't currently being held by either team, but could be taken if we wanted. Usually we look at free space from the perspective of one team at a time, since what's free for one team might not be free for the other. These areas could be things like flank routes that are currently empty, or good positions in cover that a team could use to leapfrog forward to get closer to the enemy. The contested space in yellow is where things get more complicated, since this is an area of the map where one or both teams are currently committing major or unsustainable levels of resources to hold, things like big chunks of their health pools or shields, important cooldowns like bubble or lamp, or of course any ultimates. This resource commitment can be from close ranges when teams are brawling, or from longer distances via range poke. For example, let's think about a Rhine comp that pushes up towards the enemy spawn to spam after they win a fight. That area that they're in is pretty comfortably their space, since even though they might be taking some small amounts of damage or using small amounts of shield or matrix, it's an easily sustainable amount of resources spent. Any matrix will replenish, and the supports have an easy time keeping up with healing. However, once that enemy team regroups, they might peek together or even use an ult like window, which lets them put a load of damage resources into that blue area. And this is going to turn that friendly area into a contested one, as the Rhine team will have to commit heavy resources in terms of shields, health pools, and even ultimates to stay there. But since that area isn't really important to them right now, they'll likely fall back into the areas the enemy can't see, and so that they still control. Once that happens, the area ahead of the enemy team is now uncontested and effectively becomes that free space that they have the right to claim. So hopefully we can see how it's possible to break up the map into these 4 types of space, and see how those spaces change over the course of a fight depending on the ways in which teams commit their resources. One of the reasons this is useful is because it lets us look at why a certain team wins the skirmish for each section of contested space. In our example, it was because the attacking team committed window, and so more resources, into fighting for that area. But if we looked at a different situation, where we focused on the contested space in which 2 tracers were fighting for control of a flank, whichever team won that skirmish would likely be to do with who got more support via Brig Packs and Xenorbs, or even from another player like Ball coming over to help. So we can see how space control is heavily connected to the other resources in the game. It's worth mentioning that whoever wins these skirmishes isn't just about the amount of total resources spent, as we can't really quantify that in a meaningful way. It's more to do with which resources are better for fighting at that specific range or versus those specific heroes. Since in our first example the skirmish involved long sightlines, the resources brought by the Orisa team were more useful than the Rhine team. Whereas once the Orisa gets closer, the Rhine team might push out and fight at a close brawl range, an area in which the resources the Rhine comp brings to the table might get more value, both in terms of quantifiable resources like Rhine's health, cleave and shield, but also in terms of resources like Maywall and speed boost that aren't as easy to measure. So remember to be open-minded when looking at the resources teams are using to win control of these contested areas, as it's not just about adding up everyone's theoretical DPS. Another thing to mention is that when putting resources into those contested areas, they're often worth more when from multiple angles. Like when that Rhine comp pushes out onto the Orisa, they might still not have enough to win, whereas if their Cassidy pushes from a separate angle at the same time, the resources he's putting into the fight will be enough to turn it in his favour, as they're worth so much more than if they were coming from behind his own team. We'll talk about that more in the actual video on resources, but in terms of understanding space, when looking at these contested areas and seeing who wins control of them, it's usually a mix between which team is able to put more or better resources into those areas, and which team has more angle control onto that contested area in question. With all of that in mind, what does it mean to think about space as a resource? Well, we have to see it as something that teams can trade for other resources throughout a fight. Because pretty much every fight in Overwatch consists of one team pushing into a defending team, the defenders will start the pre-fight controlling all the space and having free choice of positioning within it, since the enemy is starting in spawn. Their tanks can play close, their backline can take aggressive angles, their flankers can hide wherever they want, and so on. And that control gives them great angles onto the attacking team if they engage directly forward. If the attackers start a fight with no angles versus an enemy with all the angles, it's gonna be an impossible fight. So in that sense, that map control or angle control can be considered a resource that the attacking team will have to build up if they want to push in. Of course, every team comp will take space in different ways, but to simplify things, we're looking at two main resources attackers will trade for map control. The first one that attackers will use is time. They might spend 20 seconds safely clearing one side of the map through rotations, then finding an angle they can safely use to spam the defenders into falling back. Or they might spend time skirmishing with their flankers and pouring resources into duels in order to clear enough angles to walk forward. Although any space clearing method requires the use of resources like healing and cooldowns, during these pre-fight phases where neither team has really committed, those resources are fairly easy to replenish, so we can simplify that resource cost into just being time spent. The other thing that we see used is ultimates, usually when the attacking team is under a lot of time pressure and so has to kind of cheat in order to earn some map control. And we see this a lot on control maps, where one team has lost every fight and it's almost at 0 to 99, but they have at least built a bunch of ultimates. So they'll use those ults like Rally or Bongo in order to scare the defenders into falling back and giving the attackers enough space to be able to contest the point before they lose the map. From the defender's perspective, they have a bunch of space since they're defending, and a bunch of time since they're 99 to 0, and so they're happy to trade those things for an advantage in the ult economy. So hopefully we can see how space can be used as a tradable resource, especially in that pre-fight phase. Spend some time, spend some ultimates, gain map control in return. And we see these types of trades pretty much everywhere, even in our first example with the Orisa team clearing the Rhine team using spam in order to push up. Once we get to the phases of the fight where both teams are committed, space and map control becomes most important in terms of angles. Different comps do want different types of angles, but broadly speaking, whichever team has the best ones will have the advantage, those angles being one of the main ingredients a team needs in order to stage a successful engage or win control over one of those contested areas. Once again, these angles can be seen as a tradable resource. I'm not going to go too in depth since this is a big part of next week's video, but we can imagine how teams spend resources to either get onto an angle or clear an enemy off of that angle. A tracer might spend time and blinks in order to get onto a flank, then the enemy soldier might commit visor to clear her off it before she carries the fight. Again, it's about making sure that we're seeing space and angle control as something that we can trade alongside those more easily quantifiable resources like health pools, cooldowns, and ultimates. As a final note, when we're thinking about these resource trades, often we can just use time and attention as an efficient shorthand for those smaller individual resources that are easily replenished. For example, when a Zen Tracer duo are skirmishing for control of an angle, they'll commit measurable resources like blinks, ammo, and camera time, but that level of definition isn't always that useful for us when thinking about the macro, so instead we can simplify it down into a single resource, that being player attention. A resource that we can usually just measure in terms of time. But that is kind of the main focus of the next video, so we'll talk more about it there. So hopefully that's a decent intro to an actually useful way of understanding space and map control. Thanks for watching, and again please share it around if you can. Also, since I've had a few people asking, I've finally set up the links for donation stuff if anyone's actually serious about it. Right now there's one tier, it's only £2 since I'm not going to paywall any content. There might be some behind the scenes stuff up there though, I'm just going to kind of see how it goes.